Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
All right. Well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Gregory Makoff. Greg, thank you very much for joining. I'm going to give a little bit of a background on Greg for the group. He's got a very, very interesting background, including a starting point that I don't think anybody would guess if you didn't know much about Greg. But for 21 years, Greg worked as an investment banker and a debt transaction specialist. That's where he spent a good chunk of his professional career. However, where Greg has really spent some time is on sovereign debt management, which what we're going to talk about is quite different than corporate debt. And Greg has helped several developing countries in debt management, including Jamaica, Colombia, the Philippines, and Turkey, to name a few. Greg has also worked for 1 year at the U.S. Department of Treasury as a senior policy advisor. And Greg is also the author of the terrific book. I've got it behind me here. It is called Default, the Landmark Court Battle over Argentina's $100 billion debt restructuring. I have read the book, and again, I would highly recommend people take a read of it, especially if you're interested in sovereign debt. And the reality is that if you live in a country and you're paying taxes and you care about things like inflation and the future of the country, you probably would have a strong interest in sovereign debt management because it literally would impact your day-to-day life. So Greg, in his book, took a hard look at Argentina and what happened in that country, which is what we're going to talk about. But again, I would highly recommend people take a read of that book. It is very, very interesting learning about sovereign debt. But one of the most interesting things about Greg that I had learned is one shocking aspect of his biography. If all you knew about Greg is that he spent his entire career or most of his professional career in debt management, you probably would have guessed that his educational background would be something finance-based. But what is shocking about Greg is that he actually has his PhD in physics from the University of Chicago. So he's basically a physicist, which I would have never have thought, Greg, that somebody would transition from being a physicist to going into debt management. So perhaps you can bridge the gap for us. How does somebody transition from being a physicist in a university to going into being a debt management expert? That seems like quite a 180 turn, but maybe you can fill us in the gaps. Maybe there's more closer parallels than I give you credit for. But how do you go from one to another? That seems like polar opposite.
Oh, well, thank you, Scott, for having me on CSI Chat. This is going to be a fun conversation, as you've highlighted, touching on issues of government debt and developing market debt. This is a time to be worried about debt, to be worried about rates, to be worried about government policy. And we tend to think of those crazy developing countries like Argentina and no, they keep having problems, and that's down there and we're up here.
Yeah.
But the reality is they're ordering their house while we're messing ours up pretty fast. So there are a lot of lessons to learn from crises around the world because we're acting like they used to. And I'll make it relevant. As for me, life is kind of funny, and you go from being fascinated in something at a moment, but you live in a context, in a world context, in your friend context, who you meet, what professors inspire you. And my luck was I started MIT as an undergraduate in physics and political science, as from Los Angeles, a family, we read the paper, we talked about the news. And I swear I started MIT the week Mexico defaulted on its debt in 1982, triggering the LDC, less developed country debt crisis of a decade that was finally only resolved in the 90s. So the financial pages throughout the 80s had Citibank in trouble with their emerging market debt. And it started my first day. And while I was in my political science classes, I heard about it. I saw
see.
John Reed from Citibank come and talk. even talked at the Sloan School kind of off the record, and I snuck into that. And I was fascinated. I didn't understand it, but I met postdocs from Brazil. I said, what should I read to understand this more? But then I realized I couldn't get a job as an undergrad in physics. Like I could be a product reliability expert or something. And in political science, there was nothing I can do with those undergrad degrees. So I went to grad school in physics, but it was experimental particle physics at Chicago, which is no Fermilab. I did wires. I did spark chambers. We did data analysis. I fixed problems. And I'll tell you, fixing problems in a lab is not very different than fixing problems on a massive $2 billion debt transaction on Wall Street. You get the lawyers, you get the accountants, you calculate the numbers. So I'm much more a doer. I'm not the guy at the chalkboard in the movie with his mind exploding. That's a different kind of physicist, not like the Oppenheimer model. I'm the guy blowing stuff up in the other scene. And so for me, it was very natural, but often if I go to a country in Jamaica that had 350 bonds and they couldn't pay it, and we swapped it and extended it and lowered the coupons and squeezed them into 30 bonds. And it was a big spreadsheet and there were a lot of calculations, but you're just neat and careful about it. That's something you're trained in physics. Check all your numbers 3 or 4 times because when it matters, it has to be right. So it's kind of a discipline. And I think I gave a lot of help to parties who were less comfortable with a lot of numbers and seeing the relationship between all of them. So for me, it was this obsession with sovereign debt. I did do my physics. And when I came out, I'm like, I'm not going to have a great career here. I was an okay student, but there were one reported possible job at Berkeley when I was graduating and they got 600 applications. And that wasn't going to be me. And so I read about Wall Street and my wife was working at Morningstar and she was getting a CFA, Chartered Financial Analyst. I started reading her books, said, I can do that. So I applied for a job in Salomon Brothers, hired physicists back then. And I got into derivatives, working with corporations on interest rate swaps and their debt. And the person who covered Latin America quit after a year or so. And I grabbed that seat because I always wanted to do Latin America debt after that experience. So that's the short story. For me, it's very continuous, just following my fascination. Who are these countries? Why do they get in trouble? Is debt crushing their life and is the problem? Or how do they get out of this trouble? And that becomes a very macroeconomic policy story, seeing countries in the early 90s when I started mostly coming out of a decade trouble. And 30 years later, most of them are doing really well because they made good choices. A few of them, like Argentina, kept getting in trouble because they made bad choices. So I have a lot of experience with policy choices and outcomes. And now we're at the United States and other countries around the world making bad choices. And I feel like we're acting like an emerging market because numbers do matter. How much debt you're taking, just basic questions. What are we going to do with our cash flow over the next 10 years? And instead, you have what I call politics trumping policy. The politician wants you to juice the numbers to get elected, and we'll worry about it later. Of course, we'll grow so fast, all the numbers will work. And that doesn't work for Democrats or Republicans or leftists or rightists for too long. And so those are the sort of things from my career that I think are relevant to this conversation. And where I am now after quitting Wall Street after 21 years to write, spending a little time of that decade at the Treasury, but I really spent 7 years on this Argentina book following their disastrous default of 2001 in this huge dispute they had over cleaning up that debt. All the while, they go through a boom and bust and make the same mistakes all over again. So in 2023, they're back in the same mess, and they have this new president, Javier Milei, with a chainsaw saying, okay, I'm never going to default again. We're going to clean it up for good. And he wins the election by a big margin. So it was a great story to dive into with a lot of technical, political, legal, economic stuff. So I really enjoyed that research project. Since February when it came out, I've been talking about it. But as the years gone on, I'm talking more and more about US debt.
Yeah, and we're taping this interview actually at a very interesting time. This is the day after the US election results. We're actually taping it on the Wednesday, and the US election results were decided very late or very early in the morning on again on late on Tuesday night, early on Wednesday morning. So it's a very interesting time to have this discussion. One thing I wanted to talk to you about, and we're going to talk a lot about, is the difference between corporate debt versus sovereign debt. And when you started as a debt specialist at Solomon, are those two separate career paths, Greg? Like, what led you down? What made sovereign debt so much more interesting than corporate debt? Do you learn on the corporate debt side first before you go into sovereign debt? Like, how does that career, or is it two completely different things?
There's nothing more fun than the Solomon Brothers trading floor because you have this big floor with 400 people. And like every desk of 5 or 10 people is a completely different universe, completely different specialist. We're all doing bonds, buying bonds, issuing bonds, selling bonds, trading bonds, valuing bonds, derivatives on bonds. But one desk, they'll all be the mortgage guys
I
made
see.
famous in liar's poker. Then another
Yeah.
desk will all be trading US Treasury bonds. And all they do is talk about that universe of US Treasury bonds. And they're on the phone to the biggest US pension funds and insurance companies. Those are core holdings, banks, hedge funds, buying and selling and trading the relative value of the curves and futures against them all day long. Then you have your corporate debt, and maybe some guys focus on one trader focuses on the industrials and another focuses on the utilities and
I
another
see.
focuses. So you have people, and then you have the FX desk, right? They're
Yeah.
trading the currencies. And then you have the high yield desk, and they're doing all the high yield names, which was like a dozen people back then. And then over in the corner, you have the emerging market trading desk. And over on the far corner, you have the emerging market origination team. So the traders and salespeople talk to the clients to buy and sell all day. The origination people, they get on the plane, they go down to Brazil. We said, we heard you need to borrow $1 billion this year. Can we lead manage the issue? And you vie to get the mandate and you make a proposal. You respond to a request for proposal. And maybe you are a joint lead manager with JP Morgan of $1 billion 10-year bond for the Federative Republic of Brazil. Then you go to what's your syndicate desk, which prices things, and then it's released over to the trading desk, and then they trade it in the secondary market after the initial placement. So you have this machine of people bringing product. So primary markets are a big deal in investment banks because anyone could set up a secondary trading desk, but what really brings information is being in the primary market, getting the new corporate issue, the new sovereign issue, the new mortgage issue. So you have the machine of the originators, the syndicate desk, and the trading desks and
Got it.
salespeople. So it's very dramatic, but it takes 2, 3 years to understand the geography of these 400 people because you walk down the aisle and usually you make friends or you rotate as an associate. So you get to understand this world, but you basically map the whole financial world. I mean, the world, the US
Yeah.
financial world, but the world's financial world across this one floor. And they're all hyper technical. Oh, they're similar expertises. You're buying and selling bonds. There's certain legalities and things, but typically you live in one of those worlds or the other. And I started with corporate and just derivatives. Do you want to do an interest rate swap to go from floating to fixed because rates might go down, or you want to balance your portfolio? And there are some analytical people downstairs who can help companies think through that choice.
Yep.
But I switched towards doing that kind of conversation with the Latin American borrowers. And then over time, I switched from just giving them products to sort of saying, hey, you're kind of in trouble. Can I help you for a year? So I switched more to being an advisor, which I really enjoyed doing.
And because that's the other thing is like in the time you had spent, it's not just sovereign debt, it's sovereign debt at developing nations, sovereign debt where some of these countries are having issues. Why the focus on what made the developing nations aspect so unique? Why not? Because presumably there's also a big market for either the US or the UK or Germany or Canada. Some of these more developed nations where again they have a little bit more financial structure, but your focus seemed to be on these developing nations that were really having issues with debt. What was the interest on some of these developing nations that you were helping?
Well, by the 1993, when I started, most of the countries are recovering. So they're no longer a restructuring story. They've done what they call Brady plans. They swapped all their kind of troubled bank loans into 30-year bonds with some collateral of their principal, with the help from the World Bank. And they were back in the market and they were issuing what's called global bonds, and just a normal 30-year or 10-year bond to global bond, meaning it was a SEC registered bond in dollars, 10 years, but sold in Europe and Asia at the same time. So at that time, a Mexico or Brazil would sell bonds to US pension funds, US insurance companies, US asset managers, British asset managers, French asset managers, and Asian asset managers, creating this new asset class, which might have had a spread of 250 over US treasuries. And US corporate bonds might have had a spread of 100. And so it had extra yield, and that yield was worth it for a big pension fund who might have 80% of their debt in treasuries and US corporates to put 5 or 6% in EM corporates because it added yield. It could be diversified. And you're talking about, the government bond or a Telmex bond, a Petrobras bond, like really high quality stuff. So they would hire a few credit analysts because they figured out the yield was worth it. And these countries had reformed and they'd gotten off the debt trouble train. And Argentina got off the train, but got in trouble and fell back into it. So it was like
Yeah.
a fallen angel. But most of the countries, Brazil, Mexico, Panama, Chile, Colombia, Peru, they haven't gotten back into trouble yet. So it was a really good asset class. Indonesia, Philippines, South Africa, they've been really big issuers regularly in this market. And it's a universe of $1 trillion now.
Yeah.
And that'll include like some of the Middle Eastern countries and stuff, and the Pakistans and Ukraines and stuff. But a lot of it's pretty high quality. Some of it is edgy. So it's $1 trillion market. And when we mean sovereign, we mean a developing country or middle income country who borrows under English law or New York law. So government debt may be Brazil borrowing in its own country under its own law, in its own currency usually,
I
or
see.
inflation linked. But when they come here under our law, we'll call that sovereign debt. Now, the
I
US
see.
Treasury market, I don't know if it's 70, 80 trillion dollars. So the whole emerging market debt market's like $1 trillion. So it's small, but the characteristic is it's under our law. So they promise to do it under New York law. And if there's a non-payment, to be subject to the jurisdiction of the Southern District of New York. And in my book, Argentina doesn't pay, and they're subject to the jurisdiction of this cranky judge, Thomas P. Grisey, who helps Argentina for 5 years, then gets really sick of them and throws the book at the country.
Yep.
There's a lot of sympathy at the beginning, but it gets very messy. And it's kind of a lesson like, if you want to know how this weird world of developing countries borrowing under our law, read this book, because everything that can go wrong does go wrong. And people say, well, why don't they just borrow in their own country? Why expose yourself to a foreign court? So there's a lot of big questions. But the bigger question is where we started was, why are these countries getting in trouble with debt? And I would say, well, why is the US probably getting in trouble with debt? Why do some companies get in trouble with debt? I mean, I guess most of your guests are talking about corporate matters. So we can start there, because
Well, and
how do you think about like corporate
Well, and I think
Yeah.
that's the way to look at it is that the way to at least start educating people is the difference between corporate debt versus sovereign debt. And again, you talked a little bit about some of those differences where, again, you're kind of relying on a court that is based in New York and you're in Brazil or whatever it may be, but maybe just talk a little bit about, because a lot of the finance folks would have a really good understanding of corporate debt. You go to a bank, the bank lends to that legal entity, $10 million or whatever the number is. The bank has security over, maybe it's receivables or cash or whatever assets of the company. If the company goes bankrupt or the company can't service, the bank would potentially step in and make a claim on those assets. All of that seems relatively clear from a corporate perspective. But from a sovereign perspective, it's a totally different situation. I'm not even sure if there's even a legal entity that exists at least in the same way as a corporate entity. So maybe, Greg, educate people a little bit on the fundamental differences between corporate debt, which we would have a good understanding on, and sovereign debt, which we would have a very little understanding on.
Well, first let's do math, because I would say the math of debt is universal, meaning there's
100%.
a safe amount of debt a
Yep.
particular entity can have or not. And that's basically related to its net cash flow, right?
Yep.
So, regardless of the security and the amount, we've got figures in our head, ratios, where is it interest expense to revenue, debt to capitalization? In high yield land, it's always interest expense to EBITDA, right? So, or adjusted EBITDA for non-cash flow items. So
Yep.
the bankers, the credit people calculate metrics, which are usually flow, right? Because you want to make sure on a steady state, you've covered your interest expense 2, 3, 4, 5 times.
Yep.
And if it's 5 times, it's super safe. If you've covered it 1.2 times,
Yep.
because it's a utility and it's securitized and you're sure it's very stable, you can get happy with that. But that's like a pretty low margin and you better have very stable flows. So in the end, it's a ratio. Sometimes it's the balance sheet. If you can have a readily discernible, liquidatable asset value, I hate to say this, $10 billion of NVIDIA chips, and you give a $10 billion secured loan against it. Well, if they don't pay, then you can sell the chips in the market,
Yep.
assuming the price of NVIDIA chips didn't go down 50%. So maybe you get a $5 billion loan against $10 billion worth of NVIDIA chips. I'm sure people are giving 90% loans these days because that's how leveraged the world is and
Yep.
optimistic. But it's in the end, it starts with a finance person, a conservative person, a credit person, and a risk management person saying how much debt, principal, and cash flow obligation can this obligor safely incur. And you can put a rating on it. If it's super safe, it's triple A or single A. And if it's not so safe, it's single B. And so countries will be from single A to B minus because they have different ratings, but they don't translate as strict ratios. There are ratios, but there are a lot of qualitatives on top because the equation is much more complicated because you're judging a whole country and its policy matrix and political scenarios rather than just the cash flows of a company in Canada or the US, which may be pretty easy to model, even extreme scenarios.
Yep.
We have a recession, we have big growth, you do the sensitivity analysis in the spreadsheet. Yeah. But what you said about security and the bank, and you have a claim if there's a bankruptcy, is also particularly interesting because this is where a big difference is. You know what happens if you're a bank lender and you gave your receivable security financing and the company liquidated or went into Chapter 11, assume US, Chapter 7 or Chapter 11. You know exactly your rights. You know exactly your priority. You don't have, they'll probably file in Delaware because it's issuer friendly, but you're the bank, you're the senior lender, you're high in the pecking order. You're not some unsecured creditor who might get peanuts
Yeah.
or nothing. So that's a well-known, well-legalized game. The US didn't have bankruptcy until 1896 or 1898. The Congress had the power to do a bankruptcy law, but they couldn't figure out how to do it. And creditors just wanted all their money back, and then they couldn't pay. And there were all these fights for 100 years till somebody figured out we have to have a system to give companies a fresh start, but kind of balance the creditor interest and inter-creditor fairness and stop races to the courthouse so you have a stay of litigation to have an orderly, fair, responsible, balanced bankruptcy system for corporations and individuals. And it's not too far to one side or the other. And that's the system we've been working on since the late 1800s, which has been changed in the 90s, in the 1930s, in the 70s, in the 80s. There's always slight amendments happening to tweak it because of outcomes that are kind of funny. People want to fix it, but it's a highly tuned, reliable system. Put in the corporate lender's perspective, as a senior secured lender, you know you're probably going to get back 70, 80, 90, 100 cents on the dollar. You're not going to get 30 cents. It's very predictable. The process is predictable. You might sell it off to someone who does the dirty work, or at Citi, there was the institutional recovery mechanism, or the ERM department. You just sent the bad loans to the ERM department and they took care of it.
Yeah.
And they knew the process and would fight through the committee. So sovereigns are very different. They're the same in that you can make a metric or two or three that is relevant. And for me, I have a very easy metric for the Canada, for the US, and most countries is interest expense to revenue. And so when I see a country with an interest expense, which is 5% of their net revenue, not their net revenue, just of revenue, I think that's fine, because if they have to spend on schools and they have to spend on security and they have to spend on health, they have to spend on everything else, 5% of the pie leaves 95% to pay for the other social needs. When I worked with Jamaica, their interest expense to revenue got to 55%.
Wow.
How do you take care of your people while balancing rolling this debt? It's eating up all your fiscal space, and it's getting bigger every year because you have no capacity to pay down principal. So if 1 year it's 45, then it's 50, then it's 55, then it's 60, then it's 70, then you can't provide any services to your people. And they say, well, give me services, don't pay the debt. And if the creditors are foreigners, well, why pay the foreigners? Just don't pay them. And that's what the Argentines do. Well, they're foreigners. If the creditors are the local banks, which have the deposit of the domestic society, then there's a big, well, don't default because you're defaulting on us and we all lose our bank accounts. So there's a lot of complexities in how do you unwind it, because what happens is a country is so big relative to the economy, it's the major actor. So if a country goes down, it may bring down its banks, which may bring down its households, which bring down its companies. Whereas if you have, in Canada, a bank gives a $10 million loan to a medium-sized enterprise, and the medium-sized enterprise goes down, that's not going to affect the Canadian economy. It's small relative to it. So you have this effect that there are feedback loops between the entire trajectory of the economy. So that may constrain you. You want to cut the debt, but you can't because it will have costs. So, but also legally, here's the thing the book really focuses on, which most experts don't understand. Countries can't file for bankruptcy. They can't say, as they say in the newspaper, XYZ company filed for protection from creditors under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code. Well, there's no filing from protection from creditors. They announce a moratorium, they're in default. Immediately, all 150,000 bondholders and bank lenders to that country can go to court and sue for non-payment, or immediate violation of promise to pay and declaration of a moratorium, and go get a suit and go get a judgment and start demanding payment and start trying to grab the country's assets. That's what happens in my book. And they go after airplanes and bank accounts and bond accounts and ships. And there's a problem. If it's a Canadian medium-sized enterprise and the Canadian judge has jurisdiction, that judge, she can send in the marshals to grab the company, run the company, distribute the assets to the creditors. But this poor Judge Grisey up in New York, he can't go down to Argentina and grab assets and distribute it to creditors. He can make an order and says, Argentina, you have to pay these guys. And Argentina says, well, I don't want to. So you have a very odd system that the country defaults when it can't pay, and Argentina couldn't pay. There's no shame in that. They had a mess of bad debts,
Yep.
but they got sued. There was nothing they can do about it. And they, for a long time, refused to cooperate with the court. But they said, hey, look, I have all these creditors. I'll work with most of them. I'll give them an offer of 50 cents on the dollar. It's more complicated than that. And most of them took it. But
Yeah.
some of the creditors said, hey, I don't want 50 cents on the dollar. I want all my money back, and interest on interest and interest on interest on interest. So these hedge funds found a way to make a lot of money buying bonds at 20 cents on the dollar and getting paid 3 times by suing for over 10 years. So instead of an orderly 100 years refined system of bankruptcy, sovereign default is like 1820 United States corporate default, where there's no system, there's creditors grabbing stuff, and it's not very healthy because the country doesn't get a fresh start, and you have kind of intercreditor rivalry, a race to a courthouse where the smartest creditor runs in and tries to grab the president's airplane to
Yep.
pay off his $100 million claim, and the slower creditor says, oh, what did that guy do? So it's the book goes through how the Argentine government defaulted and how it behaved, how it tried to do deals, but it also introduces you to this wide range of different funds who sued, some very smart, some not so smart, and how they fought each other. All the characters kind of horrible. Some of them made billions, and eventually it was settled after a new government came to Argentina, and they said, this mess isn't helping anyone. I'm going to put an olive branch. Let's settle it. And he settled it in 3 months. That's the very broad view. But the heart of it is countries can't file, and it's a mess. Our corporations file, and we can have credit markets and bank lending because policymakers spent 100 years coming up with a decent bankruptcy system. What do you do when a company can't pay? And another 100 years refining it.
And presumably, one of the actions that, a company could always, if they're kind of in default and they've got a problem, the old adage, well, here are the keys, banker. You're welcome to take over and run the company and I'll jump out, pull my parachute and go off on my next adventure. Presumably that's not an option for Argentina, where the politicians would just say, debt holders, there you go. Like you say, it just doesn't work the same way as maybe a traditional corporate bankruptcy would work.
No, countries are elected officials. They're responsible for feeding their people and protecting their economy and their defense. They're proud of their sovereignty. They are there to get the best deal for their people. And the moderate ones understand that a healthy market access is good for a country.
Yeah.
And here we go back to Hamilton. The stories about Hamilton normalizing the U.S. debt, it was pure Argentina back in 1780s. We had all these states, they were all in default. They had all these quartermaster claims like, I'm going to requisition all your horses to fight the British, and gave them a piece of paper. They had bonds that were in default. They had this huge mess of debt that wasn't being paid at the Congress level, at the state level. And Hamilton said, we're a small country in a big world with the Frances and Englands of the world. We need to have a national credit. That's an asset. We need to be a good debtor. We need to pay this debt. We need to create bonds so that if we ever have a war, we can raise bonds on the market to buy weapons to defend ourselves.
Yeah.
So he deliberately did something, and I think it was 1890, 1892. He funded the debt, which means we had all this debt that wasn't being paid, but he made the government come up with the revenue to pay the debt and literally did an exchange offer, which is what I do for developing countries. You take all the old debt, and he said, we will give you for your defaulted claim 100 of a new US bond that pays 6% in 10 years, and some bonds that pay 3% but step up to 6% after 5 years, like a menu of bonds.
Yeah.
And people took the deal, including Harvard College. I saw the list. Harvard College owned 10 million US bonds, and they participated in the deal. And the school endowments still buy a lot of sovereign bonds and participate in the deals, which is kind of funny. And he set a tone of fiscal responsibility, and a national part of it is we needed the United States of America, not the Articles of Confederation, because in the 1780s, we depended upon each state voluntarily giving money to the center, and they wouldn't come up with the money.
Yeah.
Oh, no, we don't want to. But once you're the United States of America with the federal system, with the power, the federal government could tax and use that revenue to pay the debt. So the United States went from a defaulting Latin America country style of the 1980s to a good debtor with Hamilton, and we become the premier issuer in the world from that commitment to always protect our AAA rating. It's just in the last, since 2000, we've just been borrowing like crazy.
The other topic that's really interesting in your book is this concept of security. Can debt holders go in and start claiming military aircrafts? You have a great story in your book about a boat from Argentina that goes and into port, and all of a sudden they've got a big problem because the boat is about to be sieged. Maybe just talk a little bit about security, because again, you talk about corporate debt, it's quite clear. Like you say, you come in, you take receivables, you take the cash, you liquidate the receivables, and hopefully you get all your money back. You talked about NVIDIA chips. You could, take the NVIDIA chips, sell them, and get paid back. But in a sovereign debt situation, you can't go and start claiming nuclear bombs and saying, hey, I'm going to go sell this off to, country X, Y, and Z. It doesn't quite work the same way. And you've got some really good stories in your book about some examples of how that played out in Argentina.
Yeah. Well, let me frame it generally that there are two impossible problems of sovereign debt. The first is what I'll call the holdout creditor collective action problem, is that you could have 150,000 creditors and they all rush to the courthouse and try to grab the assets at the same time. There's no bankruptcy process where there's a vote of 2/3 of similar creditors and the judge blesses and confirms the deal and it's binding on everybody and the old debt is discharged and new debt is issued. There's no discharge, there's no vote. It's each man or woman for himself. That's impossible problem number one Argentina had. Impossible problem number two is how to make the sovereign country obey anything. Now, historically, countries were run by kings and queens, and countries afforded the businesses and persons of the foreign countries absolute immunity. When the king of England went to France or Italy and they ran over a little kid, they couldn't be sued because you can't bring a royal person to court. That would be an offense. So there's this absolute immunity. And when the bad uncle goes and steals some money, and you can't put him in jail. You've heard sovereign immunity. It's even in like Lethal Weapon 2 was all about sovereign immunity and the South Africans and guns. It's like, you can't come into my house. This is sovereign immunity. And so sovereign immunity is well known as this thing, and it used to be absolute. And the world had a problem. So the first approximation is every time you try to grab a sovereign ship or boat or bank account, someone argues sovereign immunity.
I see.
But it's not absolute anymore, and there is room under law to take it, because what happened historically around 1900, it was absolute. But the Russians, after the revolution, set up these state trading companies. They were always 100% state owned, and they would buy 50,000 pairs of boots from an Italian manufacturer. Leather boots, nice expensive boots for their army. And then they would say, oh, never mind, I don't want to buy them, after the factory had already made all the boots, and millions of dollars. And then they try to sue them, and they say, sovereign immunity, I'm the Russian state. And then finally, the European countries said, you know what? If you're trading in the market like a company, like any person, you don't get sovereign immunity in our courts. We're going to restrict immunity if the government sends a government ship to your port, a military ship, for example. That's covered by sovereign immunity. We don't want Italy taking a Russian ship. That would cause a diplomatic thing. But if you're going to buy boots and not deliver, we're going to bring that entity to court. So around the 1820s, 30s, every country started adopting the restricted theory that if you're doing business, we can sue you and attach your stuff and treat you like a company. If you're doing government work, then we can't.
I see.
And it was kind of informal in the US, but in 1976, the US formalized it into the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which tried to clarify what's a business type of asset that you can attach and sue, and what is a government type of asset. It's not 100% clear, but every single scene in my book, they're arguing about the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act and can you attach this and can you attach that? Argentina says, no, it's a government asset. You have to release it. And the creditor says, no, it was being used for a commercial purpose. And the airplane, when the president's airplane was coming in 2007 to California for engine service at GE or something, one of the plaintiffs tried to get a restraining order to attach the 767 or whatever it was. And the argument was, well, it's getting engine service, and that's a service that anybody could get. But then the judge gave a temporary attachment. The Argentines heard about it. The plane never landed. So it never came. But then there's the following. This always happens. It's tricky because governments get a wind of things. They even knew there was millions of dollars of cash to buy fuel because they didn't want their money stolen. So the creditors had all sorts of inside information. And the judge, when Argentina came and argued in the follow-up hearing, they had the potential attachment released forever by saying, look, this was an airplane run by the Air Force of Argentina, and under the law, you can't take any central bank assets or any military assets. So it's a military asset. I don't care if it was going for engine service or not. You can't take a military asset. The second one, it was the president's airplane for diplomatic purposes, and you can't take diplomatic assets. So go away. It wasn't being used for a commercial purpose. Now, if Argentina had bought a bunker full of oil in New York Harbor to buy and sell, now you can take that because there's no military or diplomatic purpose to trading oil with commodity traders. That is takeable. So some creditors found a few takeable things, but for the most part, they were very small. And most of the plaintiffs found stuff that Argentina would say, well, actually, you can't take that under the black letter of the law. So the 1976 Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, it allowed you to sue the sovereign. It allowed you to try to enforce and take stuff, but it set a very high bar. And only the cleverest plaintiffs. So Argentina defaults in 2001. It restructured 76% of its debt voluntarily in 2005. But between 2005 and 10 were hundreds of lawsuits by holders of about 20 billion of bonds. And they all failed because the judge said, let it go, let it go, let it go, let it go. And in 2010, Argentina gave him a second chance. And most of those 20 billion holders said, I'm tired of not getting paid. So they took Argentina's 50 cents on the dollar. In Argentina by 2010, 92% of its defaulted 100 billion had taken its deal because suing was really hard. You've got to be a really, really specialized, legally oriented investor to sue a country, and you got to be prepared to sue for 20 years. And there's a firm called Elliott Associates who specialized in this. They were in the 8% in 2010, said, we're not taking the deal. We're going to be after you forever. And judge, here is a new way to force them to pay. And so as soon as they finished their 2010 deal, the Elliott people, with a bunch of other guys in the wings who knew this was coming, had a fresh legal attack, which eventually prevailed. And that caused the last third of the book, all this drama. Nothing in that last third is as any parallel to corporate. It's the weird world of sovereign debt where it's impossible to collect. So the courts invented, or Elliott invented, a solution to make up for the complete lack of law and process. And it's like sometimes you hear of class action lawsuits and they go on, and the judge just says, okay, I signed the deal. And people complain, what about this? Future claimants aren't going to get a fair deal. Sometimes the judges just sign it because they want it to go away, because there are 50,000 plaintiffs. It's gone on for 10 years. It's kind of like, it's more in the category of, this will solve the problem, I'm going to sign it.
So the way you've articulated this is a lot more complicated than traditional corporate debt, sovereign debt.
Yes.
One of the things you do reference in your book is there's a lot of reference to legal fees, and the legal fees are not a rounding error when it comes to some of these disputes. These are big numbers. So you probably have some people listening on the phone is saying, Greg, like, who in their right mind would actually make investments into these countries, knowing all of these risks that are out there? You've got, again, it's totally different than corporate debt. You've got all of these different, rules and regulations that are kind of overlapping each other. If you get into a dispute, a lot of these countries, again, are far away, as well, and different cultures and customs and things like that. Who is actually the ones that are actually lending cash into these entities, into these countries themselves? Who would it, and is that different than, let's say, a traditional corporate borrower or a corporate lender, excuse me?
Well, I frame it like totally differently, in the sense that a bunch of these different sovereign borrowers, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Philippines, very reliable countries, I don't know, 10, 20, $30 billion of bonds outstanding. A typical bond might be $3 billion size. Liquid, traded, you can get it from 5, 10 different dealers. You can see the price every day.
Okay.
It's traded fairly. You can buy it, you can sell it, get a good deal, earn a yield over treasuries. Sometimes, like, the market's volatile. It can trade way off and it gets really cheap and you buy it. They might trade really tight because in Philippines, the local banks get a lot of remittance flows and they all buy the government bonds. So they tend to trade tight. So you have to be aware of the dynamics, but it's a great asset class. I would 100%, if I had $100,000, let's say, I put it into sovereign bonds.
Okay.
They're countries who are not in trouble, won't be in trouble. They're stable. They're reliable. They report to the SEC. They report their IMF Article 4 disclosures every 2 years. There's rating agencies. You can monitor them like you monitor corporations, and you can hear their leaders talk and how responsible they're being with their budgets. This is a safe asset class, and you earn a coupon.
Yep.
Total opposite of Bitcoin. You
Yeah.
get no income. There's nothing there. It's just a bit on a computer somewhere. You're betting it's
Scary.
going to go up and someone else is going to buy it. For
100%.
me, like Dogecoin, like who would put their savings in it? I would put my money in JP Morgan and let it sit there. If I need $100,000 to buy a house or medical expenses next year, I'm depositing it in JP Morgan Chase. If I have 100,000 and I need to earn more yield to retire on over 20 years, I may buy a Philippines bond or an Indonesia bond or a Mexico bond, and I may be happy with that, or change it over time. If I don't like the new president and they're getting irresponsible, I may sell that. But what happens is sometimes a country does well for a couple years, and then its president starts overspending like crazy. And you're like, it's time to exit that position because I don't like the direction. And we just had an election in this country last night, and the guy is promising to get rid of our revenue base. So not to transfer it to the United States, who I see as an emerging markets credit now. Our interest expense to revenue grew from a couple percent to about 15% now. Our deficit, our cash flow deficit, is $1.8 trillion. To me, this is the biggest financial risk to the whole world economy. The Argentine economy is 600 billion. The whole economy. You can fit three Argentine economies into our budget deficit. And in a couple of years, our interest expense to revenue is going to be over 20, then over 25. People also talk about debt to GDP often, but I like to look at the interest expense to revenue, because when our interest expense to revenue goes to 50%, like Jamaica, then we can't pay for Social Security. We can't pay for schools. We're going to be a miserable, unhappy country. But people look at debt to GDP, and our debt to GDP is around 100. And here we have to understand what's happened the last 20 years. If our debt to GDP is 100, but we've just had a COVID or we've just had a financial crisis and the Fed has kept the rates at zero, we have 100% debt to GDP, but our interest expense is near zero because the Fed has kept rates or real rates at zero. So we're paying nothing on our debt.
Yeah.
But that's not sustainable. That's killing any saver in the world. You can't have a normal economy with zero interest forever. That's called financial repression. So at some point, it was going to be normal for interest rate on a 10-year bond to get near 5%. But when that happens, then the US at 100% debt to GDP is going to be spending 5% of GDP on interest expense. But if our revenue to GDP is only like 30, then that's 5 parts out of 30. See what I'm saying?
Yep.
But what happens is we have a problem and we don't have net revenue. Our net revenue is like, let's say minus 3-4% of GDP. And our real growth is like 2% of GDP. So we're not even growing out of our deficit. Like if you had a deficit of 2%, but your economy is growing 2%, in the reality, your debt to GDP will be stable because you'll have to borrow 2% more every year net, but then your economy will be 2% higher, so it's stable. But what happens is we're more deficit than we're growing. That means all our debt, every time we pay interest, we have to borrow more money to pay the interest and borrow again to pay any principal. So it will go up very fast, like completely compounding. And when you're compounding at a 5% rate, our debt is projected to go from about 100% of GDP to over 150 in 25 years. And then our interest expense to revenue is going to go over 30%. And the cost to work that off is going to be tax raises and spending cuts that are going to make every household, every business unhappy. So it's like we're burning our fuse now. I'll give you tax cuts. Yeah, but the question is, how do you fund that tax cut? If the tax cut is funded with debt, we have to pay interest on interest on interest on. All debt is future taxation. So if you're going to give a tax cut paid with current revenue, fine, that's good for the economy. But if nobody's talking about balancing our budget, they're talking about cutting taxes quickly to boom the economy, borrowing debt. So you get a boom, a bust, and you're left with the debt and you're left in misery. But that political economic cycle is short term election to midterms. And the economic responsibility is 30-year planning. And we're not dominated by policy people who run numbers. We have a complete triumph of politics over policy. Any rational person, and that's why I point the Congressional Budget Office puts online a long-term budget forecast with all these numbers. And if you have show notes, attach that, and all the numbers that I discussed, they're all right there on one page.
And there's been a lot of discussions about tariffs, but the thing I never really like you say, Greg, it's all math. That's the one common thing here is this is mathematics. There's no hiding. But what I never really understood is that yes, you can increase tariffs, but at the end of the day, if those products either coming into the country or being made in the country are going to cost more, at the end of the day, it's the consumer. Those costs will just get paid right back to the consumer. So you can either increase taxes or you can increase the price of cars by 20% through the use of tariffs. Am I thinking about that properly, Greg?
Well,
Because I just would like you almost have to pick your poison, right? Is that it's the people that the revenue is going to be generated by the people, presumably, right? And that is there's only so many levers you can pull.
well, let's put tariffs about for a second, because I want to reinforce what I said. Is you said it's about math, but then we're talking about public policy and
Yeah.
conservative, prudent investing and financial management. You run numbers. But what we have is the triumph of politics over policy, where the politicians will say anything to get elected, regardless of whether the numbers add up. And our problem, why I think we have an Argentina problem, is they had a left side and a right side. Usually the left would win and overspend, and the right side would do things that didn't add up in a different way. And they flipped and flopped from one side to the other, constantly getting in more debt. And then they would blow up, and then they would boom for a couple of years, and then they would blow up again. And they did that for 200 years. But what happens is our polarization looks like Argentina now, where we have one party who can, in a fiscal equation, you have to either raise taxes or lower spending to make a budget balance. We have one party who will say, we will never, ever raise a tax. We will only cut them. So no fiscal responsibility from that side. And the other side, we can't cut any spending at all because all spending we have is necessary. Whether I'm more sympathetic to that side or the other, we do not have a rational conversation here. There is no basis for, in Congress, a bipartisan process to say, our debt is skyrocketing. How in the next 5 or 10 years are we going to bend that curve down so we don't blow up in 30 years? Nobody's talking about it. And that's my problem, is the quality of our policy conversation is gone. All conversations are politicized with bogus numbers, promises, and bizarre hodgepodge policies. Are we really going to make up for our tax cuts with tariffs, which are just going to raise the cost of goods? Like, I'm not even sure these numbers add up, or anybody has modeled the effect of those on our growth and our exports when people retaliate against us. Like,
Yeah.
this is uncharted territory, except for those lessons we learned in the 30s, which didn't end well. And it's politicians blaming our problems on foreigners. And their solution now in Argentina, in my book, they blame all of the country's problem on the vulture investors suing them in the court, wanting a couple $1 billion. Meanwhile, they're massively overspending. So they're distracting the public from their bad financial management by blaming all the problem on foreigners. Sounds familiar? United States, we have low unemployment. We've come out of COVID well. A lot of things are going well. We're fighting to get our dominance again in tech, where China's catching up and doing very well. And all of a sudden, we're blaming all our problems on hardworking immigrants. because they're easy to pick on. And so it's the politics of distraction, of fomenting hate and anger. And there's just, as you mentioned, that fund, Elliot took this beautiful ship, this Fregata Libertad, this three-masted ship called the Liberty. So it's like Argentina's Statue of Liberty. It goes to Ghana and they get a court to grab it. But under international law, they went to the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea, and all the judges said, let it go. It's a Navy ship. You can't take a Navy ship. But it was stuck for 3 months. It 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 went home across the Atlantic and was welcomed by the president, the cabinet, the ship's crew, tens of thousands of people in the street screaming against the vultures. We're not a colony, we're the homeland. Viva Argentina. I'll have a video of that on my website. Well, actually, on my website, there's a www.defaultthebook.com. There's a trailer for the book, and you can have pictures of that ship and everybody screaming. So it's actually Elliot trying to take that ship made the president more popular, because
Yeah.
then they could play the victims of the foreigners trying to suck their blood. So it's what we're having is complete politics and not policy. And I think we're rational people. Your clients, people listening are, say, business people. We think about debt. We think about growing businesses. We think about avoiding worst case scenarios. Well, over in the state house, we have people who aren't even doing the basic fiscal prudence thing. They're looking at polls, and that worries me. And it worries me there'll be rate volatility. You remember the Liz Truss crash, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So 2022 September, Liz Truss released a budget that was too aggressive and the bond
Yep.
market crashed.
Yep.
All the funds, it's a thin market in the UK, mostly 5 pension funds own everything. And they all decided they didn't trust the government. And we have a massively liquid market in the United States. We're not going to have a Liz Truss crash, but we can certainly have rates go up. How does that help Canada? How does that help the world if US long bonds start going higher?
So maybe just talk a little bit about, I totally hear what you're saying. I think if you look at a public company, you could tell if you're a sophisticated reader of those financials and what's going on with the company, you can tell if there's warning signs, the share price, the cash flows, common ratios and all that sort of stuff. But with a country, it's a little bit more complicated, probably trying to figure out, if you're a citizen in a country and you're worried about debt, what are some of the warning signs that you would start to see that might indicate that there's just too much debt? Because like you say, it's not a problem, at least right now, that you'd say we're going to fall off a cliff tomorrow. What you're talking about is looking forward into the future. What would be some of the warning signs that would start to get you really concerned about, up in Canada, hey guys, you guys are just taking on way too much debt, and I can tell through X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, there's a kind of a different type of accounting, but the Congressional Budget Office is always doing projections out 10 years. And every time we pass a law, they make a model of what the net cost or benefit of the law will be. And a prudent financial manager reads those reports, and a prudent lawmaker reads those reports and considers the effect if they vote for or against a bill. And our current estimates, Harris and Trump, but Trump a lot worse, has the debt going up really fast. And so the question is, in the next Congress, as our Congress people vote on whatever tax cut and tariff or whatever, what scenarios is the Congressional Budget Office going to come out with? And is anyone going to say, how are we going to do it? Because what's going to happen is the administration will amp up the growth assumption that because we give tax cuts, our growth will go to 12%, so it will all pay for itself. But the
Yep.
Congressional Budget Office isn't drinking whiskey. They will give prudent, well thought through assumptions and will say how much it will cost. So whether it's Canada or the US, you have offices that calculate these numbers. They're available online. Prudent investors will read that stuff. What I'm saying is we need more discussion in the newspapers. We need more of the commentators who follow this stuff. They are out there. They're just kind of pushed to the back pages or in think tanks. And, Canada's been pretty prudent relative to anyone else. It's a well-managed country, but the United States is really off the charts. France was doing very badly. Its debt was screaming up. And then after the election, they brought Michael Barnier in to be the prime minister. And for them not talking about debt at all, the second after the election, he's like, we got a problem. We're going to fix it. And this isn't going to be popular, but we need to stabilize our ratio. So you would have hoped if Harris won, she would have brought in someone prudent to start making medium-term plans. That could still happen with Trump, but I'm not betting on it because he delivers his promises, and his promises are tax cuts.
And what did they do in France that was so successful in order to bring down the debt levels?
Well, they're now just talking about it, and it's going to create a lot of problems. That's the newspaper stories of the day.
I see.
Is how is Michael Barnier going to get through the parliament the actions needed to stabilize the French debt? But Japan's debt is very high. China's debt keeps going up and up. This is kind of a global problem. I'm more worried about the US than anything else because so much of the world economy is based on the dollar.
Yep.
And the other thing I look at when I look at adverse financial markets is this is really nerdy. I'm sorry to bring my physics into it.
We're nerds. We're nerds, Greg. We're all nerds. So we like the detail.
But it's like you look at a projection and you look at the rate of change, you look at the derivative, like this pace that's going up or down, but then look at the second derivative. Because before there's a crisis, you kind of remember the mentality in the housing crisis, if you saw The Big Short, like in the
Yep.
last months, the pace at which people were pumping out the horrible loans was going faster and faster because everybody knew the party was about to end.
Yep.
So once you start seeing like the hyperbolic, you're really near a crash. So if I see something sort of creeping up slowly over 20 years, I'm not going to panic. But when you see something beginning to move up really fast, that's when I start worrying because US debt, if you look at the Congressional Budget Office, we've gone on this hockey stick where we've gone from a very gradual increase of debt over 25 years. We had 9/11. We had Bush tax cuts. We had the credit crisis. We had continuing growing debt to GDP slowly during the Obama years because he was aware of this and Treasury was careful. And then you had COVID and it jumped up. Trump tax cuts, then COVID. And then it kept going up super fast. And then it's like, are we going to go up even faster now? So this is just like the triple derivative we got to worry about. So it's like the rate of change of financial indiscipline, when it starts moving really fast, is a worry. And that tends to be a balance sheet effect. I don't know if you studied the Irish banks went totally nuts before the credit crisis.
Oh, really?
They were just lending against real estate and all sorts of assets. They had one smaller bank who just exploded to be the biggest bank in the country, giving loan after loan faster and faster and faster. And then when it crashed, it was the worst. So when you see a new entrant come and start soaking up a lot of the market, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the US agencies, started doing faster and faster right before the credit crisis. So I think it's become a time where financial managers who borrow from the market, who have to fund their businesses and get loans, did not have to pay attention to the volatility of US rates over the last 25 years because they were relatively stable. But right now, the bedrock of all of our businesses' finance, the US Treasury market, is going to be unstable because we have these accelerating stresses coming from politicians. So what might be a 4.5% 10-year could be an 8% 10-year.
Yeah.
And if you're buying 30-year assets, then you would want to think of funding longer because the risks of jumps and going to 1980s interest rates is much higher than it was 3 years ago, pre-COVID, higher than yesterday before Trump was elected. So I'm not going to be like a doomsayer, but it's like every 3 months, all the financial managers need to read the financial press and read the skeptics about the debt I love in rates. I love following Jason Furman. He's just fantastic on Twitter. He explains everything. I follow Anna Wong at Bloomberg. She's been good on predicting rates. She predicted the Fed funds would go over 5% 6 months before anybody else. Um, None of the predictors are always right, but the ones I like following explain why things have happened,
Yeah.
why they're discerning from the numbers, these trends, and that helps managers. So I would encourage, worry about US debt, worry about our politics in the complete lack of a quality dialogue, and worry about rate volatility and be prudent.
And let's turn it back to your book then. Is you know, you talk about looking down the path 30 years. When you look at, more about the Argentine debt situation probably than anybody. Could they have predicted this 30 years ago? And what can we learn from that situation in order to avoid a similar situation in North America?
Um, it's the smart people in debt world, like fund managers and stuff, like they'll get the hints from talking to ministers in like a bad public policy environment. Like a country's paying, but the numbers look kind of bad, but they don't like the tone. And they're like, I'm getting out. I don't trust these guys.
Yep.
And it was one of the funnier things. I won't give a name, but after Greece was blowing up around 2010, a very smart Greek expert came to New York to talk to us about Greece and why Greece had blown up with its debt. And there was this like 15-year story of all the mistakes they made with their pensions and their spending and their wages. It's always complicated.
Yep.
And then walking out of the building, the person said to me, oh, what should I do in my personal account about my PDVSA bonds, which is the oil company of Venezuela, whose bonds were at 15, 16%. All the fund managers own it. And it was just on that, what I call that hyperbolic, totally increasing debt. The numbers didn't add up and they're just pumping more and more paper, total Ponzi scheme. I'm like, you're crazy. Don't you talk to me about all the mistakes Greece made over 15 years and tell me you still own a penny of
Yeah.
Venezuela. This is the default to happen. And 6 months before they defaulted, they did this really bad financing. They called them hunger bonds. Goldman Sachs reopened a bond at 35 cents on the dollar, like some horrible yield, like 20, 30%. And everybody's like, how can you do that? That's horrible. Goldman's explanation was, well, if there was a restructuring, we'd be a cooperative participant. We were helping the country get them liquidity. But the reality is, for me, this is a sign of desperation. Only someone near default is going to do something this bad. They're about to default.
Yeah.
And I wrote that my first op-ed. It was in the Globe and Mail, June 15th, 2017, I think,
Wow.
my birthday. And I get a call from a friend at the IMF later that day. It said, that was very brave of you. And I said, why? She said, oh, you just predicted that Venezuela is going to default in the next 6 months. And people have been saying that for 10 years. Why don't you tell me why you're right now and everybody was wrong before? And I hadn't realized I'd made a prediction because I was naive and I was happy to have my first op-ed published. And I felt nervous. I'm like, oh, now I have a word out there. And that was good practice before writing a book. And I told her, and I said, you know what? I know from my long experience with borrowers that when they do fundings this desperate and this stupid, they are so out of choices. The next choice is default. And she said, fine. And I was right. And I kept going to fund managers, get out of your, get out, get out. This is just like Argentina 2000 before the default. Everybody got stuck in it. And then they defaulted. And then the US said, you're not allowed to trade it and put on sanctions. And it's become a total nightmare. And they've traded down to 10 cents. Everybody's like, but they're rich. They have all this oil. I'm going to get back 50 cents on the dollar. And it's like, people, you need to have a country, you need a financial leadership, you need a plan, and they have no leadership. They have no plan. They have oil,
Yeah.
but you need to have governance and a process. So the wiser people, you start with the politics and policy making sense. financial managers like a CFO you'll know in one of your companies, a rational person who has a plan, who can work with the Congress. Once that starts, then you can say, okay, I see it's going in the right direction. I don't see any financial policy logic in the United States. And I want to encourage that discussion. Before the election, I was like, please, everyone, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, just let's look for centrists who care about policy.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm just like, I don't know.
Well, it was, I remember thinking the same thing when they were putting out these big funding packages for COVID up here north of the border, and just hoping that you had sophisticated finance people who were looking at this and were trying to make sure that the right decisions were being made, that it wasn't just an open checkbook, but it was actually trying to go into the right hands of people who actually need it, like, small businesses, restaurants that were forced to close the door. Because at the end of the day, if it's just an open checkbook, it's just going to come back to the taxpayers who are going to have to foot the bill at some point in the future. Maybe it's a year from now, maybe it's 10 years from now. But again, it's math. There's no money tree where you just pull the money off. That's just not how it works in reality. So
Yeah. Well,
um,
let me say something about my book, because we've been
sure,
talking about debt and you did invite me on my book. And
yeah,
I think what I'd say is sovereign debt, I understood when I started, was not a topic most people want to read about because it's not related. But what I what I thought was there's a universe of smart financial people, lawyers, CFOs, who would actually think this is interesting if they got into it. And so I'd heard Aaron Sorkin talking about the Social Network movie, about Facebook's history. And he said, I wanted to write a story about Facebook and how it came about. But it's boring to just say, well, this happened, then that happened, and then they did this. He said, the lawsuits are fun. So what I decided to do was frame the movie in the lawsuit with the Winklevoss brothers over who came up with the idea. And it's the same thing in Oppenheimer. They framed the history of how Los Alamos was set up around the dispute over pulling a security clearance in the
100%.
McCarthy era, which
You're right.
made it have a drama. So I did the same thing, but because of Aaron Sorkin. And I said, I don't want to write a book about all this interesting world that nobody understands because how countries default is so different than corporates. But it's I've lived in it. I've been in these deals. I've met these peoples. I've read transcripts of these judges. People should get it because
Absolutely.
it's relevant. So I said, what I'm going to do is make it a court drama about this cranky judge who gets mad at Argentina. And my characters are these Argentine presidents who give rabid speeches against vultures. And then you get to meet all the hedge funds and all their scheming and legal tactics to make billions because they figured out how to maximize interest on interest on interest in clever ways. And it also goes into their lobbying. They spent tens of millions lobbying Congress. So I made it into I wrote it like a movie. You're in the room hearing conflicts over policy, over numbers, over settling, over not settling. I do teach how this world works, but you can read it like a thriller, a financial thriller. It's not just character driven like Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis, Liar's Poker, drops you on the trading floor, Solomon Brothers, 1986-87. And you learn here's the mortgage desk, here's the derivatives desk, here are the characters and how they act. I drop you in the world of sovereign debt, but I actually am telling a history. So you meet all the people in this particular fight, and I actually go through all the steps of it. So I get more technical. I don't just pick 5 characters who are indicative. It's a longer list of characters, but on the other hand, it's actually scholarly if you read all the footnotes and everything, which you could ignore. It's a good drama, but it's actually will be the benchmark source for anyone who said, well, what happened in those cases? And
Absolutely.
and what we didn't get to is, so the 92% who took the deal got in a pickle with the 8% who didn't, because the Elliott and the other hedge funds went to the judge and said, well, we need to force Argentina to pay, but we can't find any assets because they're all immune. So why don't you just block the payments to the 92% to force them to pay us in full, and then they can't borrow from the market, so they'll be on their knees.
Yeah.
And the judge says, well, I don't want to do it, Argentina. How do we settle this? And Argentina says, I don't know. I don't have a plan. So he says, well, if you're not going to be helpful, I'm going to impose this. Then 92% have their payments blocked by the judge. This works because the paying agent, Elliott read in the documents, was the Bank of New York, under the jurisdiction of the court, because the payments go from Buenos Aires to New York. And while the order not to pay is on Argentina, a copy sent to Bank of New York, and they're not going to help Argentina breach a court order. So they don't process Argentina's payments. The 92% go into default. Again, this is 2014, 13 years after default, all the settled debt.
Crazy.
You had a bankruptcy, you had a settlement. It all goes back to disaster in 2014 under President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who didn't want to pay the vultures. And it took the next president to clean up the past payments on the 92% and find a settlement with the 8%. And they actually were really reasonable and really smart. A young banker and another young banker, the Secretary of Finance and Undersecretary, President Macri said, go to New York and don't come back till you fix the mess. And in 6 weeks, they came back and said, President, we fixed the mess and we got a 25% discount. So they saved like $1 billion. They both get promoted and stay in the Macri government, which didn't end very well. And then when Milei gets elected last year, he picks the two heroes of that settlement negotiation. Luis Caputo, who led it, is now the Minister of Economy for Milei. And Santiago Basile, who was his deputy, is now the head of the Central Bank of Argentina. They are core members of the team fixing this debt mess. They're experienced bankers. They're experienced at cleaning up messy litigation. Argentina has more messy litigation from the last 20 years to clean up. So you have this kind of bizarre episode, this drama, this legal financial drama where you learn about this world, but it actually feeds straight into Argentina today because characters in the book jump out of the pages into the newspaper today. And a lot of the lessons learned in this book, how much time do you spend fighting over some guy who bought your debt cheap versus how much time do you spend actually balancing your budget?
Yeah.
And Milei's focus is balancing the budget. And whether, he's had a good first year, but there's lots of newspaper articles now. Is he going to get support from the IMF? Will he win the midterm elections? This is current events. Anybody with any interest in Argentina, the book is well motivated. But if you're kind of thought this discussion of bankruptcy or not bankruptcy, like what would life be if we didn't have a bankruptcy law, on the more theoretical intellectual side, it's people, lots of fund managers write me saying they really loved it, and lawyers and reporters. It's not an academic book.
I agree with that. And I think it goes beyond people who are into the details on debt, because maybe what you could just touch on a little bit is the impact on the average citizen. Because I read your book, Greg, and I think, man, what would happen if something similar happened up here in Canada? What would be the impact on my life if something similar that happened in Argentina actually happened up here in Canada? How would that impact me as an average citizen? Maybe just talk a little bit about it over and above pension managers and people who are into those details. Maybe just talk a little bit about why the average citizen would find it interesting, because if a country defaults on their debt, what happened to the average citizen in Argentina?
That's interesting. I should talk to the publisher about putting the forward and the introduction on the internet so people can read that and say, oh, I like that. I'll read the rest of the book. Because for a lot of people, they read that and they say, I want more. But I think what I'd say, which is important, is I was very committed this to be scholarly and neutral. I had great characters. I did not have to amp up the president of Argentina or the hedge funds or their lawyers or this judge. They just ranted.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, why should I rant? So I kept as far back out of the way and I looked for quotes in the court documents, in press releases, sometimes in interviews, but not often, and in IMF documents. And I basically have my characters fight each other. And I sometimes before a scene, I have to explain, well, they ended up in this room this day fighting over this. This is why that issue mattered. And then I have them fight with each other for a page and a half. Then I have a little filler material and we go to another fight where I explain what it's about. And then I just quote directly. So you learn by hearing them fight each other, but it's not a polemic. And so much of what we're reading this day is either from the conservative or the leftist side, where all you're hearing is blah, 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 blah. I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. The other guy's evil. And so you don't actually learn anything. It's like the question is which side I am on. And so when I think of a general reader, it's like, how do we solve difficult problems where there are two rights? Yeah, we want low taxes. I want low taxes. That's good for business. But I don't want poor people in the street.
Yeah.
We used to have that. There's a reason we have the safety net. So how are we going to sit down and find a balance? And instead we have finger pointing. And so when I think of people listening to it, it's like there are 300 pages of partisans yelling and screaming and pointing. And all it really is a failure to compromise in 2005 over the terms of the deal. In the end, in 2016, when they settled it, the court had appointed a special master, a kind of arbiter, a mediator guy, and he sat between Argentina and the hedge funds who hated each other still. Even though it was a new government, there was total distrust. And the mediator bashed their heads until they cut a deal. And they were screaming at each other to the end, refusing to get on the phone. No deal, no deal, no deal, in all caps and emails the day before. And then finally, the special master intervened and he said, guys, it's this, or you're going to be fighting till the end of time and you're both going to lose. And they said, okay. Total paraphrase, but it's like, it's about compromising. It's about being analytical. And it's about, hey, let's not go into a fight and always be on a side. And
Yeah.
I'll give you an anecdote from Steve Martin, who had a master class, which was brilliant. When he was in college and was trying to be a writer, he was with a writer friend and there was a fight in the student center. And you know what happens in a fight? Everybody, all the people like crowd around in it into a tighter circle and they're going fight, fight, fight. And everybody's, whose side are you on, right? Are you on his side or his side? And the friend pulled his shoulder and pulled him back and said, watch. As a writer, watch how the conflict develops. Watch how it escalates. Watch how it gets resolved. Don't pick a side. Be analytical about it. So when I'm watching it, I'm trying to present the sides with their own passion and their own truths, some of which are amped up to win their case and some of which they truly believe, and teaching people, let's try to think about all the public policy issues. And I'm much more of a listener, both sides, whereas you're brought up, I'm in a Democratic household and a Republican, I don't have to listen to the other side. I actually feel like a better person because usually the person I disagree with has a truth. And if you recognize it and you agree with it and you say, but could you agree with me? I have a bit of truth too. So it's about compromise. And so I think there's a lot of levels at which to talk about it. But I do think the general audience are more financial legal people. But if you have a student who said, I've always wanted to know about third world debt, then I'd say, okay, I got a book for you.
Yeah, it's a great book. I agree with you. I think it's a very very good book, especially if you have a level of financial background. I totally agree. Last question for you, Greg, as we wrap up. Any plans? You referenced a bunch of movies, you know, the Big Short and things like that. Is there any plans? Like you said, it watching conflict unfold and you've got a lot of really strong characters. It would make for a good, you know, series or movie or whatever. Is there any discussions to turn the book into something, some other format other than what it is right now?
Well, to start with, I'm working on updating my www.defaultthebook.com to first put a timeline where you can click on it and see movies. Because
Cool.
there's movies of Argentina declaring default in Congress. There's movies of the minister announcing the success of its deal. There are movies of Argentina saying they're going to default in 2014. There's movies of this homecoming of the ship. So to start with, because it's all available, I'm just going to put that up so people can have a quasi documentary based off YouTube videos. And then for law professor types who might want to use the book in class, I'm going to download like 50 of the key court documents with a table explaining what's in it. Because if you want to read any of the opinions, you can just click on it. But I would love there to be a, a drama, but like the epilogue keeps coming with Javier Mele. And there's been 2 articles in the Wall Street Journal about possible phone hacking by one of the plaintiffs, one in June and one on the 31st of October. I have no idea, you know, what's happened or didn't. And then there was some things about one of the main plaintiffs palling around with the Supreme Court justice. So there's just kind of like, I'm tempted that it becomes a fictional account with fictional characters. If people watched Billions, Billions
Oh
is
yeah.
is
Oh.
is sort of based on Stephen A. Cohen, but it's totally fictionalized because you can't say it. So I would rather write it with people involved with it and fictionalize it and amp it up. But what's happening is some new news is coming out that is actually stuff I was gonna fictionalize.
Yeah.
So I'm I'm I those things take 5 or 10 years, and my focus has been, like, telling the story, talking to classes and professors, but I started working this summer on the outlines of it, and it's gonna take some gestation. But if there are any producers out there or writers who say, "Oh, I wanna be involved," I'll listen to anybody. But it's not the easiest thing to make a compelling movie, and I was very happy with what the producers and writers did on Oppenheimer. I'm a physicist. I love Oppenheimer's story. If you told me, "Oh, Greg, write a spec script on the Manhattan Project," I would say I won't bother. Nobody would ever watch a physics movie, and I would have been wrong.
Yeah.
So,
100%. Who would have thought that that would have been one of the most watched movies of that particular year that it came out? And yeah, you're right. And it's an event that happened. What are we talking? 70 years ago now? Like what? I'm not sure I got the math, but you're talking about events that happened so long ago, and yet it's one of the most watched movies of that particular year. It's nobody would have predicted.
but but the most compelling part of the movie is his relationship with his left-wing girlfriend from the 30s in Berkeley. So, while you cover the historical drama, what appeals to us is human relationships. And so you're not gonna a book is a place to tell very analytical stories and impart knowledge, but a movie is about relationships. And the question is, how do you convert a story like this as a backdrop? And that's the challenge.
I agree. I totally agree. Well, Greg, thank you very much for joining us today. I would highly recommend, especially for the people who are listening to this, a lot of them are finance professionals, pick up Greg's book and take a read of it. You will learn a bunch. You will learn more than you'll ever know about sovereign debt, but not only is it a historical issue with Argentina, it is a current issue today, like Greg has alluded to. You will learn a lot. So pick up his book, take a read of it. You will enjoy it. And Greg, thank you very much for taking the time. We really appreciate you taking some time out to talk to us today.
Well, Scott, thanks for having me. It's been great talking, and thanks for everybody listening. I wish you luck in all your endeavors and your your work and your thinking about debt. Nothing's more awful than getting that wrong.
Absolutely. Good way to finish. I totally agree. Well, thank you. Well, that wraps another episode of CSI Chat, and I really wanted to thank everybody for listening. If you want to keep up to date on CSI Chat, I would encourage everyone to join our CSI Chat LinkedIn group and or follow us on Twitter/X under CSI Chat. With that, I will get you out of here on a high note with some music, and thanks again.
Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our host an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. CSI Chat, where the numbers meet the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun. From taxes to true crime, we'll find the hidden clue. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. See the case through. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. We'll solve it with some humor and go the extra mile. Got a question about investments or a tale of deceit? We'll break it down with laughter and never miss a beat. No need for serious faces, just a sharp wit and a smile. With humor and some spreadsheets, we'll see the case through. Tune in every week for a mix of win facts with the clever accountant who's got your back. We'll laugh and we'll learn and solve the mystery on CSI Chat, where the topic set us free. Tune in every week for a mix of win facts with the clever accountant who's got your back. We'll laugh and we'll learn and solve the mystery on CSI Chat, where the topic set us free. CSI Chat is the podcast you'll adore. With our accountant host, you'll always want more. So grab your headphones and join the fun on CSI Chat, where the mystery's never done.